CVPR 2026 Part 2. This is a continuation of the video reasoning theme. I want to discuss a presentation by Ranjay Krishna, who gave a keynote this morning in one of the workshops. Now, his work at Paul Allen Institute focuses on video reasoning, in particular, an implementation of the idea of chain of thought for spatial understanding. He starts the presentation actually with some psychological or cognitive science ideas, where he kind of alludes to the fact that intelligence surfaces from spatial movement. And I think that's a theme that we actually picked up, probably about 8 years ago when we started investing in technologies that, today we would call maybe robotics or humanoid robots or some sort of AI-driven robotics. I don't know. There's still not a fully understand or fully accepted standard word for it, but it's certainly not robotics like KUKA or Fanuc, and it's not AI like ChatGPT. So it's embodied AI moving around in the real world, surfaces an emergent property that we call intelligence. Language has been, speech has been around way before language. So what we call language and the large language models are almost like a footnote in the evolution of intelligence. Now we can use it and bootstrap ourselves with that, and there's nothing wrong with that. But fundamentally, I think going back and trying to apply the bitter lesson to spatial intelligence is at least an avenue worth pursuing. And I can see that there's a battle probably evolving now between the labs, like World Labs, OpenAI, and all these people, Amazon, FAR, Meta. They're coming from the language model side because they have they lack two things. One is they don't have any hardware expertise, and two, more importantly, they have no desire or no strategy to actually tackle spatial intelligence. They think that with language, they can pretty much understand everything. Now that, to me, that's certainly not going to happen. So that's why we are on the side of whether it's Ranjay or Jitendra or Sergey or Tesla or other companies that are approaching the spatial intelligence problem from the actual spatial front. Now, we have said many times before, we think that the way we see the trajectory is that we learn, first we pre-train from video, and this is actually Ranjay, supports this idea. So we pre-train from video. Now, he implements some spatial understanding in the pre-training phase. So that's the novelty here. That's what he's discussing. So when we pre-train, let's say a robotic, spatial AI model from human video, we kind of have two fundamental approaches. One is we can do end-to-end with no priors, or we can have architectural decisions that are a little bit, it's not like we put priors in there, but we make architectural decisions. And I think that's probably a reasonable avenue. So for example, he introduces a concept of sketching. So when the model is trying to move in nature, it sketches like the trajectory. It uses tools, so tool calling, for example, depth estimation, segmentation. So there are certain tools that the model is invoking while it's reasoning in space. Is this chair, how many chairs are not blue? How many chairs are behind the tree versus not behind the tree? Those are the kinds of things that certainly require a massive amount of engineering, but I guess what he's claiming is in fundamentally what he claims is that they get much better results with less data. I think that's one thing that they claim. And with that, they seem to be on track to have maybe found a way to extract more intelligence per token than the sort of brute force end-to-end. Let's just train like massive amounts of video data, do kinetic retargeting, and then go from there. Like that's I think so sketching, which is, he brings up some really interesting ideas. For example, when you solve a geometry problem, sometimes you draw lines just to make it more palatable for your own sake. Let's say you have to understand, I don't know, 7th grade math or something, where you have to understand angles of triangles, and then you draw certain lines to make it more visual. And I think this is also in line with yesterday's discussion with Professor Du and others that talk about visual reasoning. I think the idea to use helpful tools, waypoints, some way or form of chain of thought within embodied reasoning, I think makes a lot of sense. So that's fundamentally, I think, what Krishna is talking about. And he also applies perception tokens, which is kind of like tokens that don't have a specific semantic meaning, but they are maybe something like before or after. Like, for example, if the robot has a problem, how many tokens are closer to the camera and how many tokens are further away from the camera? Or you can segment the thing, so you can call a tool which segments it, and then you have tokens for closer to the camera versus further away, or closer versus further, and then you can solve the problem. So this type of understanding, it's kind of like the spatial intelligence. It comes very intuitive to us humans. Like when we walk through a forest, we know a tree is closer versus further. We know there's a creek. We have an understanding of how wide the creek is. And it seems to me that, like in many other situations, maybe if we have plenty of data, we might not need these types of architectural decisions, but maybe we don't have that much data. So this approach that Krishna et al. Are using, in my opinion, is trying to be more efficient with data. There's also a paper that they presented at CVPR, synthetic data for object detection and subtraction. So here they're generating synthetic data to then train the model to actually develop spatial intelligence. Now, this is, of course, always a little bit dangerous when we have this generative models creating the training data for the model itself, so we could have a closed loop situation. But nevertheless, I think this goes into the direction of what we spoke yesterday, generative models in general for robot training. They also have a learnable tokenizer, which I think is interesting, again, dealing with more efficiency. So you have a video tokenizer that can, for example, do object traction. So if a ballet dancer's arm is one token throughout the whole 30-second dance video, it doesn't have to generate tokens every sequence of the video. So more efficient token generation. So those are the kinds of things that they're working on at Paul Allen. I think, again, it's kind of like a mixture of trying to use as many learnable methods as possible, but using architectural choices in order to make it more efficient. Now, where do we stand here? I think our view is, again, and I think Professor Krishna actually would probably support that. Like we have pre-training at internet scale data. Now, whether we have architectural choices in there, for example, for spatial intelligence or not, that let's put that aside. But we want to pre-train, and most importantly, what we need to do is, of course, kinetic retargeting for pre-training. Then in mid-training, that's where we would use maybe special tasks. So train the robot to actually make coffee, to use the Wozniak coffee maker example or something like that. And then fine-tuning, we fine-tune the model against benchmarks to then test them against benchmarks. Of course, we can also create our own benchmarks. I think a couple of other things I want to mention here. The MolmoAct is an open source, fully open source model for video reasoning for robotics. So where they actually treat the robotics problem as a video prediction and video reasoning problem. And I think that in itself is also very interesting. So there's the code, open weights, training data, everything is given, so you can actually work with that. And I think this is kind of akin to AlphaMayo. I think AlphaMayo is the same instantiation in self-driving that NVIDIA is using. So these are good starting points. I think we can use these models and train your own data. And I think that also is what AlphaMayo is supposed to be, is the base for others to then use it and develop their own actual products. So where does this leave us? I think maybe just for listeners, purpose of this podcast is to give people a sense for what it feels like to run a hedge fund. So we're attending CVPR because it is the most relevant conference in the AI circuit that really tackles the embodied AI problem, because the embodied AI problem is a visual problem. It's a visual reasoning problem. I think that's the way we see it, and that's why we are in CVPR. And I think CVPR is the gateway towards embodied AI. Whether that is the gateway towards general artificial general intelligence, let's leave that aside. I think that's a debate we're not really interested in. What we're interested in is, of course, commercial products like robotaxis, cybercabs, and eventually humanoid robots that can actually perform useful tasks at scale, and therefore companies like Tesla can sell work and transportation as a service. Thank you.